The applause inside the university graduation gala was loud when Billionaire CEO Jeffrey walked in beside his elegant fiancée. Cameras flashed. Faculty members stood to greet him. Then he stopped walking. Across the hall stood Zendaya, calm, steady, holding the hand of a little boy. The child looked up at Jeffrey with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, why does that man look like me?" And the woman standing beside Jeffrey already knew the answer. "Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been incredibly supportive, and I truly appreciate every single one of you. I promise to always give you the best stories I can as I continue learning and getting better every day. If this is your first time watching, take a moment to comment below and tell us where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far this storytelling family reaches around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can officially join the Mr. Graham Stories family, where every story carries a lesson, a little emotion, and something meaningful we can all take with us into our own lives. Now, let's begin. Years before the cameras, the headlines, and the billion-dollar deals, Jeffrey's life looked very different. These days, people described him with words like precise, controlled, and unshakable. Business magazines praised his discipline. Investors trusted his judgment. In boardrooms full of powerful executives, Jeffrey was the man who spoke last because when he finally did, people listened. He lived in a world of glass offices, private flights, and meetings scheduled months in advance. From the outside, it looked like the perfect life. But the strange thing about success is that it often grows from decisions people rarely talk about. Quiet choices, moments that change the direction of everything. Jeffrey knew exactly where one of those moments lived in his memory. It lived in a classroom. Long before the expensive suits and international conferences, Jeffrey was simply Professor Jeffrey, a business strategy lecturer at a respected university. Back then, his office was smaller. His schedule was simpler. His concerns were focused on students, research, and lectures rather than corporate mergers. Every semester he taught a course that students both admired and feared, strategic decision-making. Jeffrey had a reputation for challenging people to think deeper than textbooks allowed. He rarely lectured from slides. Instead, he asked questions, real questions, questions that forced students to look beyond numbers and examine the human choices behind every business decision. One autumn morning, sunlight filtered through the tall classroom windows while students settled into their seats. Jeffrey stood at the front of the room, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, reviewing a case study written on the board. The room quieted when he spoke. "A company is about to launch a product that will make millions," he said calmly. "But internal reports show it could harm small local businesses." He paused, looking around the room. "What should the CEO do?" Several hands went up immediately. A student in the front row spoke first. "Launch it anyway," he said confidently. "That's how competition works." Jeffrey nodded slightly. "Interesting." Another student added, "The CEO should delay the launch and redesign the product." Jeffrey wrote both answers on the board. Then he asked another question. "What responsibility does a leader have to people outside their company?" Silence settled across the room. Most students looked down at their notes, except one. In the third row, a young woman raised her hand slowly. Jeffrey noticed her immediately. She wasn't trying to stand out, but there was something steady in her expression, the kind of quiet confidence that made people listen when she spoke. "Yes?" Jeffrey said. The young woman leaned forward slightly. "I think the real question is whether the CEO believes success should only benefit shareholders," she said thoughtfully. A few students turned toward her. She continued, "If leadership decisions only help the people already winning, then the system never improves for anyone else." Jeffrey studied her carefully. "What's your name?" he asked. "Zendaya." Jeffrey nodded once. "And what would you advise the CEO to do, Zendaya?" She didn't rush the answer. "I'd ask him to consider what kind of legacy he wants," she said. The classroom became very quiet, because Zendaya wasn't just answering a question. She was challenging an idea. Jeffrey rested his hand lightly on the desk at the front of the room. "Legacy," he repeated. Then he smiled slightly. "That's a word executives don't always like hearing." A few students laughed, but Jeffrey kept looking at Zendaya. There was something different about the way she thought. Many students chased the correct answer. Zendaya chased the honest one. The discussion continued for another hour, but Jeffrey found himself noticing something. Every time Zendaya spoke, the conversation shifted. Not louder, just sharper. After class ended, Students packed their bags and filtered toward the door. Jeffrey erased the boards slowly while the room emptied. When he turned around again, one person was still sitting at her desk. Zendaya. She approached the front of the classroom with a notebook in her hand. "Professor Jeffrey," she said politely. "Yes? I had a question about the research project." Jeffrey gestured toward the desk. "Go ahead." Zendaya flipped open her notebook. "I'm studying how small businesses respond when large corporations move into their neighborhoods." Jeffrey nodded. "That's a complicated topic. That's why I picked it," she replied. Jeffrey leaned slightly against the desk. "What made you interested in that subject?" Zendaya thought for a moment before answering. "Where I grew up," she said, "family businesses were everywhere. Restaurants, barber shops, little grocery stores." She paused. "Then big companies started moving in." Jeffrey understood immediately. "And things changed," he said. Zendaya nodded. "Some places survived," she replied quietly. "Some didn't." Jeffrey watched her expression. She wasn't speaking with anger. She was speaking with understanding. That difference mattered. "What's your goal with the research?" he asked. Zendaya smiled faintly. "I want to understand how leaders make those decisions." Jeffrey folded his arms. "Not many students choose questions without easy answers." Zendaya shrugged lightly. "Easy answers don't teach much." Jeffrey let out a small laugh. "That might be the most honest thing I've heard all semester." Zendaya gathered her notebook. "Thank you for the discussion today," she said. As she turned to leave, Jeffrey spoke again. "Zendaya." She stopped. "Yes? You should keep asking those questions," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Jeffrey smiled slightly. "Because most people stop once the answers become uncomfortable." Zendaya considered that. Then she nodded once. "I won't." She walked out of the classroom a moment later. Jeffrey remained standing near the desk. He looked at the empty seats around the room. Professors often recognized strong students. But every once in a while, someone appeared who challenged the way you thought about your own ideas. Jeffrey had a feeling Zendaya was one of those people. At the time, he didn't realize something else. That simple conversation after class was the beginning of a connection that would eventually change both of their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. The more time Zendaya spent in Professor Jeffrey's class, the clearer something became. He wasn't the kind of teacher who simply explained theories and sent students home with assignments. Jeffrey asked questions that lingered long after the lecture ended. Questions about responsibility, about power, about what success actually meant. Zendaya appreciated that, because she came from a place where those questions were not academic. They were personal. Zendaya had grown up in a lively neighborhood where life was rarely quiet. During the summer, music drifted through open windows while neighbors talked across front porches. Children played basketball in the street until the streetlights came on, and the smell of grilled food traveled from backyard to backyard on weekends. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where elders kept an eye on the younger generation, whether those young people wanted the supervision or not. Zendaya's grandmother was one of those elders, a strong woman with a warm voice and a way of speaking that made every word feel important. When Zendaya was younger, her grandmother often sat beside her at the kitchen table while she studied. One evening, after watching Zendaya work through a stack of school books, her grandmother said something that stayed with her. "Baby," she said gently, "never let anyone convince you your story is small." Zendaya looked up from her homework. "What do you mean?" Her grandmother smiled. "I mean, the world has a habit of telling people from places like this what they're allowed to become." She tapped the table lightly. "Don't listen." Zendaya never forgot that conversation. It shaped the way she approached everything that followed. School was never just about grades. It was about opportunity. It was about proving that where you started didn't define where you could go. Back at the university, Jeffrey began noticing Zendaya more often, not in a way that crossed boundaries, but in the way a teacher recognizes a student who thinks differently. When discussions became complicated, Zendaya didn't rush to speak. She listened first. Then she asked the kind of questions that forced the entire room to reconsider their assumptions. One afternoon after class, she stayed behind again. Jeffrey was organizing a stack of papers when he noticed her waiting near the front desk. "Another research question?" he asked. Zendaya smiled slightly. "Actually, yes." Jeffrey gestured for her to continue. "I've been thinking about our discussion last week," she said. "The one about corporate expansion?" Zendaya nodded. "You said leaders should consider long-term impact," she continued. But how often do executives really think about the communities affected by their decisions? Jeffrey folded his arms thoughtfully. Less often than they should, he admitted. Zendaya leaned against the desk slightly. That's what I thought. Jeffrey studied her expression. You ask questions like someone who's seen these situations up close, he said. Zendaya shrugged gently. I grew up watching businesses disappear. Jeffrey raised an eyebrow. Because of larger companies? Sometimes, she said. Sometimes because people in power didn't think about the consequences. Jeffrey nodded slowly. It wasn't anger in her voice. It was perspective. And that difference made her arguments stronger. As weeks passed, those brief conversations became more common. At first they stayed strictly focused on coursework, case studies, research ideas, leadership philosophy. But gradually the discussions widened. Zendaya spoke about her neighborhood and the people who helped raise her. The barbershop where debates about sports could last hours. The small restaurant owned by a family who treated every customer like a relative. The church gatherings where music filled the entire building. Jeffrey listened with genuine curiosity, because his upbringing had been very different. He had grown up in a quiet suburban home where success was expected and emotions were rarely discussed openly. Dinner conversations often revolved around careers, education, and future plans, structure, achievement, order. Listening to Zendaya describe her community felt like discovering a completely different rhythm of life. One evening after a late lecture, their conversation continued while they walked across campus. Students hurried past them on their way to evening classes. Your neighborhood sounds lively, Jeffrey said. Zendaya laughed softly. That's a polite way to describe it. Jeffrey smiled. And what would be a more accurate description? Loud, she replied, but in a good way. They walked for a few moments in comfortable silence. Then Zendaya asked something unexpected. What about you, Professor Jeffrey? He glanced at her. What about me? What was your neighborhood like growing up? Jeffrey thought about it. Quiet, he said. Zendaya grinned. That explains a lot. Jeffrey laughed. Does it? Yeah, she said lightly. You're very organized. That's a criticism? No, Zendaya replied quickly. Just an observation. Their conversations were easy, natural, but both of them understood something important. A line existed between professor and student. Neither of them crossed it, at least not intentionally. Then, one afternoon, the weather changed everything. Classes had ended early because of a heavy storm rolling across the city. Rain poured down against the campus sidewalks while students rushed toward buses and parked cars. Zendaya stood under the entrance canopy waiting for the rain to slow. A few minutes later, Jeffrey stepped outside carrying a stack of folders. He noticed her immediately. Looks like we're both stuck, he said. Zendaya watched the rain bouncing against the pavement. Unless you enjoy walking through storms, Jeffrey smiled slightly. I prefer staying dry. They stood side by side while thunder rolled in the distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The campus had grown quiet as most students disappeared into buildings. Zendaya finally glanced at him. You know something? She said. What's that? You're different from most professors. Jeffrey looked amused. I'm not sure if that's a compliment. It is, Zendaya said. You actually listen. Jeffrey studied her expression. And you challenge people in ways they don't expect. Zendaya tilted her head slightly. Is that a problem? Jeffrey shook his head. No. Rain continued falling around them, soft but steady. And in that quiet moment, both of them became aware of something neither had planned. The connection between them had grown beyond classroom conversations. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both felt it. Something had shifted, something real, and neither of them knew yet how complicated that realization would eventually become. By the time the semester moved toward its final weeks, something had quietly changed between Jeffrey and Zendaya. Their conversations were no longer limited to research questions and classroom discussions. They still respected the boundaries that existed between them, but the space between those boundaries had grown more personal. Sometimes their talks happened in Jeffrey's office after class. Other times they walked across campus while discussing Zendaya's research project. What started as academic mentorship had slowly turned into something deeper. Neither of them rushed to name it, but both of them felt it. Zendaya challenged Jeffrey's thinking in ways few people ever had, and Jeffrey treated Zendaya with a level of respect that surprised her. He never spoke down to her. He listened, carefully, One evening, after a long discussion about leadership ethics, Zendaya closed her notebook and studied him for a moment. "Can I ask you something not related to class?" she said. Jeffrey leaned back slightly in his chair. "That depends on the question." Zendaya smiled. "Why did you become a professor?" Jeffrey thought about it. That wasn't a question most students asked. "Because I believed teaching would allow me to help shape future leaders," he said. Zendaya nodded. "And do you still believe that?" Jeffrey paused. "Yes," he said finally. Zendaya looked satisfied with the answer. Moments like that became common. Two people with different life experiences discovering how much they understood each other. But life has a way of changing direction without warning. And that change arrived one afternoon when Jeffrey received a phone call that would reshape his entire future. Jeffrey was sitting in his office reviewing student presentations when his phone buzzed on the desk. The number belonged to an executive recruiter he had spoken with months earlier. Jeffrey answered casually. "Hello?" The voice on the other end sounded excited. "Jeffrey, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "No," Jeffrey replied. "What's going on?" There was a brief pause. "I'm calling because the board of a major technology company has made a decision." Jeffrey listened carefully. "They want you to become their next chief executive officer." Jeffrey leaned back slowly. The position was enormous. One of the fastest growing technology companies in the country. Global expansion, billions in potential revenue. It was the kind of opportunity most business leaders spent their entire careers hoping to receive. For a moment, Jeffrey didn't speak. The recruiter continued. "They believe your leadership philosophy is exactly what the company needs." Jeffrey finally exhaled. "When would this begin?" he asked. "Soon," the recruiter replied. "But there are expectations." Jeffrey frowned slightly. "What kind of expectations?" The recruiter's tone became more careful. "The board wants stability." Jeffrey understood that word immediately. Public image, corporate reputation, executive behavior. Large companies avoided anything that could attract negative attention. Jeffrey nodded slowly. "I understand." But even as he said it, a thought moved quietly through his mind. Zendaya. Later that week, Jeffrey asked Zendaya to meet him for dinner. They sat in a quiet restaurant corner, away from the evening crowd. The atmosphere felt different that night, heavier. Zendaya noticed it immediately. "You look like someone who has big news," she said gently. Jeffrey gave a small smile. "That obvious?" Zendaya nodded. "Very." Jeffrey rested his hands on the table. "I received a job offer." Zendaya leaned forward slightly. "What kind of job?" Jeffrey hesitated. Then he said the words plainly. "A CEO position." Zendaya's eyes widened. "That's huge." "It is." For a moment she simply looked at him. Then she smiled warmly. "You deserve that." Jeffrey appreciated her reaction. But the conversation wasn't finished. "There's more," he said. Zendaya's smile softened. "What is it?" Jeffrey took a breath. "The company's board has strict expectations about public reputation." Zendaya understood immediately. Her expression became thoughtful. "A relationship between a CEO and a former student could attract attention," she said quietly. Jeffrey nodded. Neither of them spoke for several seconds, because both of them realized what that meant. Zendaya leaned back in her chair. "I always knew your life was heading somewhere big," she said calmly. Jeffrey looked at her carefully. "I don't want this to change what we have." Zendaya studied his face. "Jeffrey," she said softly, "you're about to lead a company that will affect thousands of employees." He didn't answer. Zendaya continued. "And the truth is, the world can be unforgiving when it comes to public perception." Jeffrey felt frustration rising. "So we just give up?" he asked. Zendaya's eyes softened. "This isn't about giving up." "Then what is it?" Zendaya reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "It's about protecting the future you worked for." Jeffrey looked down at their hands. He didn't want to accept what she was saying, but he also understood the reality she was describing. Zendaya smiled faintly. "Sometimes loving someone means not becoming the obstacle in their path." The words were calm, but they carried enormous weight. Jeffrey shook his head slowly. "I don't like that logic." Zendaya laughed quietly. "Neither do I." They sat there for a long moment. Finally, Zendaya stood. Jeffrey looked up. "You're leaving?" he asked. Zendaya nodded. If we stay here longer, we'll start convincing each other to ignore reality. Jeffrey stood as well. Outside the restaurant, the city lights reflected off the pavement. Zendaya looked at him one last time. "You're going to do great things, Jeffrey," she said. He didn't reply, because at that moment success felt strangely hollow. Zendaya stepped back. "Take the job," she said. Then she turned and walked away. Jeffrey watched her disappear down the sidewalk. For the first time in his life, ambition didn't feel like victory. It felt like loss, and neither of them realized that life had already set something else in motion, something neither of them knew about yet, a future that would bring them back together in a way neither could have predicted. Years had passed since the night Zendaya walked away from that quiet restaurant. Life moved forward the way it always does. Jeffrey accepted the CEO position that had once seemed like a distant possibility. The company grew quickly under his leadership. Headlines followed. Business journals praised his discipline and decision-making. Success arrived exactly the way people expected it would. And over time, the memory of the life he almost built with Zendaya settled into a quiet corner of his mind. Not forgotten, just distant. But life has a strange way of bringing unfinished stories back at the moment people least expect them. That moment arrived on a warm evening at the university where Jeffrey had once taught. The campus was alive with celebration. Graduation banners hung from the tall columns outside the auditorium. Families gathered across the courtyard taking photographs. Proud parents hugged their children, while faculty members greeted former students returning for the ceremony. Inside the main hall, the atmosphere was even more energetic. Rows of chairs filled the large space while university officials moved across the stage preparing for the evening program. At the front entrance, a quiet wave of attention moved through the crowd. Jeffrey had just arrived. He stepped through the doors wearing a dark, tailored suit, the kind that fit so perfectly it almost looked effortless. Years of leadership had refined the calm confidence he already possessed when he was younger. People noticed immediately. Some guests whispered to each other. A few faculty members approached to greet him. "Jeffrey, it's been too long," one professor said warmly. Jeffrey smiled politely and shook the man's hand. "It's good to be back." Beside him stood the woman who had become a familiar presence in his public life over the last 2 years. His fiancée. She carried herself with the same polished composure that often surrounded people in Jeffrey's professional world. Elegant dress, calm smile, the kind of quiet confidence that made cameras naturally turn toward her. Photographers near the entrance lifted their cameras. Flash, flash. Jeffrey paused briefly for a photo before continuing into the hall. The sound of applause rose when the announcer at the front recognized him. "Please welcome one of our distinguished alumni and current CEO, Jeffrey." Jeffrey nodded politely toward the crowd as he walked forward with his fiancée. From the outside, everything looked perfect. A successful executive returning to the place where his journey began. But then something unexpected happened. Jeffrey stopped walking. At first it was subtle, just a slight pause in his steps. His fiancée noticed immediately. She turned slightly toward him. "Jeffrey?" she asked quietly. But Jeffrey didn't answer, because across the hall, near the back row where families were gathered, he had just seen someone he never expected to see again. Zendaya. She stood calmly among the crowd, dressed simply but with the same quiet confidence he remembered from years ago. For a moment, Jeffrey wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him, but the longer he looked, the clearer it became. It was really her. Zendaya hadn't changed in the ways that mattered. Her presence still carried the same warmth that once filled classroom discussions with thoughtful questions. But something else caught Jeffrey's attention almost immediately. Someone standing beside her, a small boy. The child held Zendaya's hand while looking around the busy hall with the curious attention only young children have. Jeffrey felt something inside his chest tighten. The boy looked up at Zendaya while she adjusted the sleeve of his small jacket. Then the child turned his head slightly. His eyes moved across the room, and they landed on Jeffrey. For a moment, the world around Jeffrey seemed to grow quiet. Conversations continued. Laughter echoed from nearby rows. The ceremony preparations carried on, but none of it reached him, because the child's face had suddenly become the only thing he could see. There was something about the boy's features that felt strangely familiar, not just a passing resemblance, something deeper. Jeffrey's fiancée followed his gaze across the hall. Her posture stiffened slightly when she realized who Jeffrey was staring at, but she recovered quickly. Her voice remained calm when she spoke again. "Jeffrey," she said gently, touching his arm, "the university president is waiting to introduce you." Jeffrey barely heard her. His attention remained fixed on Zendaya. Zendaya had noticed him too. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to fold in on itself. Years disappeared. Memories returned all at once. Classroom debates, late conversations about leadership, that rainy afternoon under the campus entrance. Zendaya felt a quiet breath leave her chest. She hadn't planned for this moment, but life rarely checks with people before changing direction. She squeezed the small hand beside her gently. "Stay close, baby," she said softly. The little boy nodded. Then he looked back toward Jeffrey again. Children often notice things adults overlook. The boy studied Jeffrey's face carefully. Curious, thoughtful. Then he tugged lightly on Zendaya's hand. She looked down at him. "What is it?" she asked. The boy pointed quietly across the hall. "Mommy." Zendaya followed his gaze. Jeffrey was still standing there, watching them. The boy tilted his head slightly, studying the man with serious curiosity. And then he asked the question that stopped the moment completely. "Mommy, who is that?" Zendaya looked back toward Jeffrey. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Years of distance stood between them, but now that distance had suddenly collapsed into one room. And Jeffrey knew something with absolute certainty. This reunion was not a coincidence. It was the beginning of something he wasn't prepared for. Because the moment he looked again at the small boy standing beside Zendaya, he realized something that made his heart begin to race. The child's eyes looked painfully familiar. Jeffrey stood frozen for a moment after hearing the boy's question. "Mommy, who is that?" The words were simple, curious, completely innocent. But for Jeffrey, they landed with unexpected weight. Across the hall, Zendaya held the boy's hand gently, her posture steady, even though she felt the same wave of memories rushing through her. For several seconds, neither else moved. The distance between them suddenly felt much shorter than the years that had passed. Jeffrey finally drew a slow breath. Then he began walking toward them. His fiancée noticed immediately. "Jeffrey," she said quietly, her voice still polite for the people standing nearby. But Jeffrey didn't stop. Each step across the hall felt strangely heavy. People around him continued chatting and greeting each other, unaware that something much more personal was unfolding just a few feet away. Zendaya watched him approach. She had imagined many possibilities about seeing Jeffrey again someday, but none of those imagined moments looked like this. Standing in a crowded hall, holding her son's hand, watching the man she once loved walk slowly toward them. The little boy squeezed her hand again. "Mommy," he whispered. Zendaya knelt slightly beside him. "It's okay," she said softly. By the time she stood again, Jeffrey was only a few steps away. For a moment, the three of them simply looked at each other. Years had passed. Lives had changed. But the familiarity between Jeffrey and Zendaya had not completely disappeared. Jeffrey spoke first. "Hello, Zendaya." His voice was calm, but she could hear the uncertainty beneath it. "Hello, Jeffrey," she replied. Her tone carried warmth, but also distance. The kind of distance people develop after learning how to protect themselves. Jeffrey nodded once. "It's been a long time." Zendaya gave a small smile. "Yes, it has." The little boy looked up at both adults with growing curiosity. Children can sense when adults share a history they don't understand. He studied Jeffrey's face carefully. Jeffrey noticed, and something about the boy's quiet attention made his chest tighten again. Zendaya placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Jeffrey," she said calmly, "this is Sheldon." The boy lifted his hand in a small wave. "Hi." Jeffrey crouched slightly so he could look at him at eye level. "Hi there, Sheldon." Sheldon watched him with serious concentration, not shy. "Just curious." Jeffrey smiled. "What are you doing here tonight?" Sheldon answered immediately. "My mommy brought me." Zendaya laughed softly. "That's true." Jeffrey nodded. "Well, it's a pretty exciting place tonight." Sheldon glanced around the hall. "Yeah, there's a lot of people." Jeffrey chuckled. "That happens at graduations." Sheldon looked back at him again. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he asked a question with the kind of direct honesty only children have. "Do you work here?" Jeffrey shook his head slightly. "I used to." The boy seemed impressed. "Like a teacher?" Jeffrey smiled. "Yes." Sheldon nodded slowly, as if that information helped him understand something. Jeffrey stood again and looked toward Zendaya. "Are you here for the ceremony?" he asked. Zendaya nodded. "One of the students I mentor is graduating tonight." Jeffrey wasn't surprised. Helping people grow had always been part of who she was. "That sounds like you," he said quietly. Zendaya noticed the sincerity in his voice. But before the moment could settle too comfortably, Jeffrey's attention returned to Sheldon. There was something about the boy's face that kept pulling his attention. A detail that felt strangely familiar. Jeffrey cleared his throat gently. "How old are you, Sheldon?" The boy held up 3 fingers proudly. "I'm 3. Zendaya glanced briefly at Jeffrey. She could almost see the calculation happening in his mind. Jeffrey's expression changed slightly. 3. The number moved through his thoughts with uncomfortable precision. 3 years. The timeline formed quickly in his memory. The last night he had seen Zendaya. The months that followed. Jeffrey's voice became quieter. 3 years old, he repeated. Sheldon nodded happily. "Yup." The boy continued studying Jeffrey's face. Then he tilted his head slightly. Children often notice things adults overlook. He squinted just a little, comparing features the way curious minds naturally do. Zendaya sensed what was coming before the words left his mouth, but it was already too late. Sheldon pointed lightly toward Jeffrey. "You look like me." The words were spoken with complete innocence. No tension, no hesitation, just observation. Jeffrey felt his breath catch for a moment. Zendaya closed her eyes briefly before opening them again. Because Sheldon wasn't wrong. The resemblance was suddenly difficult to ignore. The shape of the eyes, the quiet way he studied people before speaking. Jeffrey looked from Sheldon to Zendaya. His thoughts were moving faster now. Memories, dates, possibilities. The pieces didn't fully fit together yet, but the question forming in his mind had already begun to take shape. And once a question like that appears, it refuses to disappear easily. Zendaya held Jeffrey's gaze for a moment. She knew exactly what he was thinking, because she had lived with the answer for 3 years. For a moment after Sheldon spoke, nobody said anything. "You look like me." The boy had said it with simple curiosity, the way children often make observations without realizing the weight their words can carry. Jeffrey felt his chest tighten. He looked down at Sheldon again, studying the small details he had tried not to notice before. The shape of the boy's eyes, the quiet focus in the way he observed people before speaking, even the slight tilt of his head when he thought about something. Jeffrey had seen that same expression many times before. In the mirror, Zendaya watched the realization forming in his face. She didn't rush to explain anything. Some truths need a moment to settle. But before Jeffrey could speak again, a familiar voice joined the conversation. "Well, this is unexpected." Jeffrey's fiancée had walked over. Her posture remained elegant, her smile perfectly controlled for the surrounding crowd. Anyone watching from a distance would assume she had simply joined a casual conversation. But Zendaya noticed the tension immediately. Jeffrey straightened slightly. "I was just saying hello," he said. His fiancée glanced briefly at Zendaya. Her smile stayed in place, but her eyes carried a different message. "Yes," she said smoothly. "I remember Zendaya." Zendaya met her gaze calmly. Years ago their interaction had been brief, but it had left a lasting impression. Zendaya nodded politely. "Hello." The fiancé's attention shifted to Sheldon. "And who is this?" she asked, her voice pleasant. Zendaya rested a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is Sheldon." Sheldon waved again. "Hi." The fiancé returned the gesture politely. "Hello, Sheldon." Jeffrey's attention remained on Zendaya. His thoughts were still trying to organize everything he had just realized. 3 years. A child who looked like him. And the last night he had seen Zendaya. The timing pressed heavily in his mind. Jeffrey spoke quietly. "Zendaya, can we talk for a moment?" Zendaya studied his face. She knew that tone. It was the same tone he used years ago when discussing difficult decisions in class. Careful, direct. She nodded. "Of course." Jeffrey glanced briefly toward his fiancée. "I'll be right back." She smiled again, though the tension in her posture grew slightly tighter. "Take your time." Jeffrey and Zendaya stepped a few feet away from the crowd, though Sheldon remained close beside his mother. The noise of the ceremony continued around them, but the conversation between the two of them felt strangely private. Jeffrey took a slow breath. "How long have you been back in the city?" he asked. Zendaya folded her arms lightly. I never really left. Jeffrey blinked in surprise. You didn't? No, she said calmly. Jeffrey ran a hand lightly across the back of his neck. There's something I need to ask you. Zendaya nodded. I figured. Jeffrey glanced briefly toward Sheldon, who had now become distracted by a nearby banner hanging along the wall. His voice lowered slightly. Is he? Jeffrey couldn't finish the question. Zendaya looked directly into his eyes. But instead of answering immediately, she reached into her purse. Before we talk about that, she said quietly, there's something you should see. She pulled out her phone. A few seconds passed as she searched through old messages. Then she turned the screen toward him. Jeffrey leaned closer. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then he noticed the dates. Email messages, several of them, all sent years ago, all addressed to him. Jeffrey read the first subject line. Jeffrey, we need to talk. The second message followed only days later. Please call me when you see this. His eyebrows pulled together. Zendaya watched his reaction silently. Jeffrey scrolled further. Then he reached a message that made his heart stop for a moment. I'm pregnant. Jeffrey looked up at Zendaya quickly. I never saw these. Zendaya nodded slowly. I know. Jeffrey stared back at the phone. There's more, she said. Jeffrey scrolled through the rest. Every message carried the same pattern. Zendaya explaining. Zendaya asking him to call. Zendaya waiting for a reply that never came. Jeffrey's voice became tight. Zendaya, I swear to you, I never received any of this. Zendaya believed him. She had always believed him. That was why the silence years ago had hurt so deeply. Because it didn't match the man she knew. Jeffrey lowered the phone slowly. If I had known... I know, Zendaya said gently. Jeffrey exhaled slowly, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But if you sent these... Why didn't we ever talk? Zendaya looked briefly toward the crowd behind them, and then her eyes moved toward the woman standing several feet away. Jeffrey followed her gaze. His fiancée stood near the entrance now, speaking politely with a group of university donors, but her attention drifted toward them more often than seemed natural. Zendaya returned her eyes to Jeffrey. Her voice remained calm when she finally spoke. Because someone made sure you never got them. The ceremony continued long after Jeffrey left the hall. Inside the auditorium, applause rose and fell as graduates crossed the stage. Families celebrated, cameras flashed, and the university president continued speaking about achievement and future success. But Jeffrey barely remembered any of it, because the moment Zendaya said those words, something inside his mind refused to settle. Someone made sure you never got them. He had tried to return to the program after their conversation. He even sat beside his fiancée for several minutes while speeches continued. But his focus was gone. The room felt distant. The words on stage sounded like noise. After a while, he quietly stood from his seat. His fiancée noticed. Where are you going? She asked softly. Jeffrey forced a polite expression. I need some air. She nodded slowly, though her eyes followed him carefully as he walked toward the exit. Jeffrey stepped outside the building and into the cool night air. The campus courtyard was quieter now. Most of the crowd had moved inside for the ceremony, leaving only a few scattered conversations near the walkways. Jeffrey stopped near the edge of the courtyard and ran a hand through his hair. For years he had handled pressure without difficulty. Business crises, financial negotiations, global decisions affecting thousands of employees. But this situation felt completely different, because this wasn't a strategic decision. It was personal, deeply personal. Jeffrey took out his phone. Zendaya had forwarded the email thread earlier that evening after their conversation. The messages were still sitting in his inbox, unread until tonight. He opened the first one again. Jeffrey, we need to talk. The message was dated 3 years ago. Jeffrey scrolled to the next. Please call me when you see this. Another one followed. I've tried reaching you several times. Jeffrey's jaw tightened slightly. He knew himself well enough to recognize something important. If he had seen even one of those messages back then, he would have responded immediately. Zendaya wasn't someone he would ignore, which meant her explanation might be true. Someone had interfered. Jeffrey continued scrolling through the conversation. Then he reached the message that had stopped him earlier in the hall. The one that made everything suddenly feel real. I'm pregnant. Jeffrey stared at the screen for a long moment. The words didn't change. They didn't soften. They remained exactly as Zendaya had written them. Simple, direct, honest. Jeffrey exhaled slowly. 3 years ago he had believed their story had ended with that quiet dinner conversation, Zendaya walking away, him stepping into a corporate future that demanded sacrifice. But now the truth looked very different. The story had not ended that night. It had continued. Without him. Jeffrey leaned back against the stone railing near the courtyard fountain. He replayed the moment inside the hall, Sheldon standing beside Zendaya, the way the boy studied his face. The casual observation, "You look like me." Jeffrey had heard those words dozens of times in business meetings when people commented on resemblance between family members, but hearing them from that small voice carried a completely different weight. He closed his eyes for a moment. The timeline moved through his thoughts. 3 years, Zendaya pregnant shortly after their separation, a child who looked remarkably like him. The possibility formed slowly, but steadily. Jeffrey opened his eyes again and looked back at the phone. He read the message one more time. "I'm pregnant." This time he noticed something else. The message ended with another line. "I wanted you to know." Jeffrey felt a quiet shift inside his chest. Zendaya hadn't written the message with anger. She hadn't demanded anything. She had simply tried to tell him the truth, which meant one thing was now clear. Jeffrey had been missing a piece of his own life, and that realization refused to leave him alone. He straightened and began walking slowly along the courtyard path. His mind moved through the possibilities again. If Sheldon was his son, then 3 years of that child's life had passed without him. First steps, first words, moments he would never get back. Jeffrey stopped walking. He understood something important. This situation couldn't remain uncertain. Questions like this didn't disappear by ignoring them. They required answers, real answers. Jeffrey returned to his car a few minutes later and sat behind the steering wheel, staring out at the quiet campus buildings. The decision came naturally. It was the same instinct that guided him during complex corporate negotiations. Find the facts, remove doubt, act with clarity. Jeffrey reached for his phone again. There was a private medical service his company occasionally used for confidential health matters. Discreet, professional, reliable. He opened the contact and sent a short message requesting a consultation. The response arrived within minutes. A DNA test could be arranged privately. No publicity, no complications. Jeffrey stared at the screen for a moment. 3 days. That was how long the results would take. He leaned back in the seat and exhaled slowly. 3 days until he knew the truth. But deep down, a quiet voice inside him already suspected the answer. Because when he thought about Sheldon's eyes, they looked exactly like his. And the more Jeffrey replayed that moment in his mind, the harder it became to believe that resemblance was a coincidence. For the first time since becoming a CEO, Jeffrey felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty, not about business, not about leadership, but about a part of life he might have missed. And now, the only thing left to do was wait for the truth. 3 years earlier, when Zendaya realized she was going to become a mother, her life changed direction in ways she never expected. The first weeks had been quiet and overwhelming at the same time. Not because she doubted herself. Zendaya had always been strong. But the future suddenly looked different from the plans she once imagined. She remembered sitting alone in her small apartment one evening, reading the pregnancy test result again, even though she already knew what it said. Her first thought had been Jeffrey. She reached for her phone and wrote the message that still existed in his inbox today. "Jeffrey, we need to talk." She believed he would respond. Jeffrey had never been the kind of man who avoided responsibility. But the days passed. No reply came. Zendaya sent another message, then another, still nothing. The silence confused her at first. Then it hurt. But Zendaya eventually stopped waiting, not because she was angry, because she understood something important. Her life was no longer only about her. A child was coming, and that child deserved stability, so Zendaya moved forward. Sheldon was born on a quiet morning during early spring. The moment Zendaya held him for the first time, the fear she carried during pregnancy faded into something else. Purpose. The tiny boy opened his eyes and stared up at her with surprising focus, as if he were studying the world he had just entered. Zendaya smiled through tears. "Hello, Sheldon," she whispered. From that moment forward, her life revolved around him. Raising a child alone came with challenges, but Zendaya approached it the same way she approached everything else in life. With determination, she continued working in education, helping young people from neighborhoods like the one she grew up in. Eventually, she joined a community center that focused on mentoring students who needed guidance and encouragement. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. Every afternoon, the building filled with energy. Children ran through the hallways carrying backpacks and sports equipment. Volunteers helped students with homework, while music played softly from someone's phone near the recreation room. Zendaya moved easily through the space. She helped organize tutoring sessions, spoke with parents, and encouraged teenagers who sometimes doubted their own potential. But no matter how busy her day became, one small voice always pulled her attention back. "Mommy." Sheldon would run toward her from across the room with endless enthusiasm. At 3 years old, Sheldon already had a personality that filled every space he entered. Curious, observant, and endlessly talkative. Zendaya often laughed because he asked more questions in a single afternoon than most adults asked in a week. Why do birds fly? Why do cars have different colors? Why do grown-ups drink coffee all the time? Zendaya answered as many questions as she could. The rest she turned into learning games. One afternoon, Sheldon sat at a small table near the window building something with plastic blocks. Zendaya watched him while organizing papers at the front desk. The boy paused and looked up suddenly. "Mommy." "Yes? Do dinosaurs eat pancakes?" Zendaya smiled. "I'm pretty sure they would if someone made them pancakes." Sheldon nodded seriously. That makes sense. Moments like that made the long days easier. Zendaya had built a life around love, work, and raising her son with the values she believed in. Even without the answers about Jeffrey. 3 days after the graduation ceremony, Jeffrey's car stopped outside the community center. He sat behind the steering wheel for a moment, studying the building. It was smaller than the corporate offices he spent most of his time in, but something about the place felt alive. Children's voices echoed faintly from inside. Jeffrey stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. When he opened the door, the sounds of activity immediately surrounded him. Laughter, conversation, the bounce of a basketball somewhere down the hall. Zendaya noticed him almost immediately. She stood near the front desk speaking with a group of teenagers when she looked up and saw him walking in. For a moment, she simply watched. Then she excused herself and approached. "Hello, Jeffrey." "Hello, Zendaya." Jeffrey glanced around the room. "This place looks busy." Zendaya smiled. "It usually is." Before Jeffrey could say anything else, a small figure rushed across the room. "Mommy." Sheldon stopped suddenly when he saw Jeffrey standing there. His face lit up with recognition. "You came back." Jeffrey crouched slightly so they were eye level again. "I did." Sheldon looked pleased. "I told Mommy you would." Zendaya raised an eyebrow playfully. "You did?" Sheldon nodded confidently. "Yep." Jeffrey couldn't help smiling. Children had a way of turning serious moments into something lighter, but Sheldon's curiosity returned quickly. He stepped a little closer and studied Jeffrey again. The same thoughtful expression appeared on his face. Zendaya sensed where the conversation might go, but she didn't interrupt. Because some questions belong to children. Sheldon tilted his head slightly. Then he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the graduation ceremony. "Are you my dad?" The room around them continued moving normally. Children laughed. A basketball bounced somewhere down the hall. But for Jeffrey and Zendaya, the moment suddenly became very still. Jeffrey looked from Sheldon to Zendaya. And for the first time since all of this began, the possibility no longer felt distant. It felt real. For a moment after Sheldon asked the question, Jeffrey didn't answer, not because he wanted to avoid it, but because honesty mattered more than comfort in that moment. Jeffrey looked down at the boy, noticing the seriousness in his expression. Sheldon wasn't joking. He wasn't guessing. The question came from genuine curiosity. Children want clarity. They don't understand complicated adult histories. Jeffrey finally spoke carefully. "That's something we're still figuring out," he said gently. Sheldon accepted the answer more easily than most adults would. He nodded once. "Okay." Then his attention shifted back to the colorful blocks scattered across the table nearby. Zendaya watched the exchange quietly. She appreciated Jeffrey's response. He hadn't made promises he couldn't confirm, but he also hadn't dismissed the possibility. That balance mattered. Jeffrey stood slowly and stepped closer to Zendaya. His voice lowered. "I'm waiting on the test results," he said. Zendaya nodded. I assumed you would want certainty. Jeffrey looked toward Sheldon again. He deserves that, he replied. Zendaya didn't disagree. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Years of unanswered questions hung between them, but neither rushed to fill the silence. Jeffrey finally cleared his throat. There's something else I've been thinking about. Zendaya folded her arms lightly. What is it? Jeffrey looked directly at her. You said someone made sure I never received your messages. Zendaya nodded slowly. I did. Jeffrey hesitated before asking the question that had been forming in his mind. Do you know who? Zendaya held his gaze for a few seconds. Then she answered honestly. Yes. Jeffrey's posture stiffened slightly. My fiancée, Zendaya said calmly. Jeffrey blinked. Even though he suspected it, hearing the words out loud felt different. Zendaya continued. She contacted me after the first few messages went unanswered. Jeffrey frowned. What did she say? Zendaya's tone remained steady. She said your life had moved in a different direction. Jeffrey's jaw tightened. Zendaya continued quietly. She told me that reaching out again would create problems for your career. Jeffrey shook his head slowly. She had no right. Zendaya gave a small shrug. At the time, I wasn't interested in fighting with anyone. Jeffrey looked down briefly. You should have told me. Zendaya's voice softened slightly. I tried. Jeffrey didn't argue, because the evidence sitting in his inbox had already proven that. After a moment, he asked another question. Why didn't you keep trying after Sheldon was born? Zendaya glanced toward her son across the room. Sheldon was now stacking blocks carefully, completely absorbed in his own world. Because I had to focus on raising him, she said quietly. Jeffrey followed her gaze. Something inside him shifted again. Responsibility, possibility, and a growing suspicion about how much of the past had been shaped by someone else's decisions. Jeffrey stayed at the community center for another half hour. Most of the conversation focused on Sheldon, his favorite cartoons, his endless curiosity, his habit of asking difficult questions at the most unexpected times. Jeffrey listened carefully. Every small detail mattered more than he expected. Eventually he said goodbye. Good night, Sheldon. The boy waved enthusiastically. Bye. Then he added proudly, come back again. Jeffrey smiled. I will. Zendaya walked with him toward the door. The evening air outside felt cooler than before. Jeffrey stopped near his car. Thank you for being honest with me, he said. Zendaya nodded. It was time. Jeffrey hesitated before speaking again. When the results come back, I'll let you know. Zendaya didn't look worried. She already knew the answer. I'll be here, she said. Jeffrey nodded once before getting into his car. Later that night, the city lights reflected across the large windows of Jeffrey's penthouse apartment. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet. Jeffrey stepped through the front door and placed his keys on the table. His fiancée sat on the couch with a tablet in her hands. She looked up. You're home late. Jeffrey removed his jacket slowly. I had somewhere to go. She watched him carefully. The community center? She asked. Jeffrey stopped moving. How did you know that? She gave a small smile. You've been distracted since the graduation ceremony. Jeffrey walked into the living room. I spoke with Zendaya again. Her expression remained calm, but something about the way she held the tablet tightened slightly. And? She asked. Jeffrey looked directly at her. She showed me the messages she sent years ago. Silence filled the room. His fiancée didn't respond immediately. Jeffrey continued. She says someone made sure I never received them. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the city outside the windows. Finally, she set the tablet aside. That was a long time ago, she said carefully. Jeffrey studied her face. Yes, he replied, but the consequences are happening now. His fiancée leaned back slightly. You're overthinking this. Jeffrey didn't answer, because something in her tone didn't feel right. And for the first time since he had known her, a quiet thought entered his mind. What if the life he believed he was building had never been entirely his decision? And while Jeffrey waited for the DNA results that would reveal the truth about Sheldon, another truth was beginning to take shape in his mind. Someone had been controlling the story far longer than he realized. 3 days can feel like an eternity when a person is waiting for the truth. For Jeffrey, those 3 days moved slowly, even though his schedule remained as full as ever. Meetings filled his calendar. Executives waited outside his office. Reports stacked neatly across his desk. Assistants moved in and out of the room discussing timelines and decisions. From the outside, everything about his life looked exactly the same. The CEO making confident choices, the leader managing a growing company. But behind that calm surface, Jeffrey's thoughts kept returning to the same question. Sheldon. The boy's voice replayed in his memory again and again. Are you my dad? Jeffrey had spent years solving complicated business problems, but this question was different. Because the answer would not only change his life, it would change a child's life. And that responsibility carried far more weight than any corporate decision. On the third morning, Jeffrey arrived early at his office. The building was quiet. Most of his staff had not yet arrived. He placed his briefcase on the desk and sat down slowly. For a moment, he simply stared at the phone in his hand. The private medical service had promised results within 72 hours. The time had passed. Jeffrey opened his email. The message was already waiting. His eyes rested on the subject line. Confidential report. Jeffrey exhaled slowly before opening the file. A document appeared on the screen. Several lines of clinical language explained the testing process. Jeffrey barely noticed them. His attention moved directly to the conclusion at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Jeffrey leaned back in his chair. The room felt unusually quiet. He had expected the result. Somewhere deep inside, he had already known. But seeing the confirmation written clearly in front of him still carried enormous weight. Sheldon was his son. The realization moved through him slowly. For 3 years, a child had grown up in the world without knowing him. First words, first steps, first birthday, moments he had never been present for, not because he didn't care, but because someone had made sure he never knew. Jeffrey closed the document and rested his hands on the desk. He didn't feel anger first. He felt something deeper, responsibility, a quiet understanding that from this moment forward his life had changed, not as a CEO, as a father. Jeffrey stood from his chair, grabbed his jacket, and walked out of the office. Less than an hour later, Jeffrey's car stopped outside the community center, the same building he had visited only days earlier. Children's voices drifted through the open doorway as he approached. Inside, the afternoon energy filled the room. Students sat at tables working on homework while volunteers helped younger children with reading exercises. Zendaya stood near the front desk, organizing folders when she noticed him entering. For a moment, she simply looked at his face. Then she knew. You got the results, she said quietly. Jeffrey nodded. The expression in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. Zendaya closed the folder in her hands. For years, she had carried the truth alone. Now it finally belonged to both of them. Before either adult could speak again, a small voice crossed the room. Mommy! Sheldon ran toward them, holding a toy dinosaur in one hand. He stopped when he saw Jeffrey standing there. A smile spread across his face. You came back again. Jeffrey crouched slightly so they were eye level. Yeah, he said gently. I did. Sheldon looked proud of himself. I told Mommy you would. Zendaya smiled faintly. You did say that. Sheldon turned back toward Jeffrey, his curiosity returning quickly. Did you figure it out yet? He asked. Jeffrey felt a quiet breath leave his chest. Children had a way of asking the hardest questions with the simplest words. He looked at Sheldon carefully. The resemblance that had caught his attention before now felt unmistakable. Jeffrey spoke softly. Yes. Sheldon's eyes widened slightly. Jeffrey continued. I did figure it out. The room around them remained busy with children and volunteers, but the moment between the three of them felt still. Jeffrey placed a gentle hand on Sheldon's shoulder. I'm your dad. For a brief second, Sheldon simply stared at him. Then the boy smiled, not surprised, not confused, just pleased. I knew it, he said proudly. Zendaya let out a quiet laugh she hadn't realized she was holding back. Only children could respond to life-changing truths with such simple confidence. Sheldon looked between both adults. So that means you're coming back again tomorrow too? He asked. Jeffrey couldn't help smiling. Yes, he said. I'm coming back a lot. Sheldon nodded approvingly, as if that answer satisfied an important rule he had created in his mind. Then he lifted his toy dinosaur again. Do dads like dinosaurs? He asked. Jeffrey chuckled. I think most dads do. Good, Sheldon said. He grabbed Jeffrey's hand. Come see my drawing. Jeffrey looked briefly toward Zendaya. She watched the scene with quiet emotion. Years of silence had finally ended. Jeffrey followed Sheldon toward the small table near the window. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt clear, but the truth he had just discovered was only the beginning. Because one more conversation still needed to happen. And that conversation would finally reveal how his past had been quietly controlled for years. The drive back to the penthouse felt longer than usual. Traffic moved steadily through the city streets while the evening sky faded into night. Headlights passed in quiet streams, and the soft glow of tall buildings reflected across the windshield. Jeffrey drove without turning on the radio. His thoughts were already loud enough. Only hours earlier he had learned the truth that changed everything. Sheldon was his son. That reality now existed clearly in his mind, leaving no room for doubt. But the truth about Sheldon was only one part of the situation. Another truth still needed to be faced. Jeffrey pulled into the underground parking garage beneath the building where he lived. The quiet hum of the concrete structure echoed around the car as he parked and stepped out. He stood there for a moment beside the vehicle. 3 years. 3 years of a child's life had passed without him knowing, and the reason for that absence was becoming harder to ignore. Jeffrey walked toward the elevator and pressed the button. The ride up felt strangely quiet. When the doors opened, the familiar hallway stretched ahead of him. He unlocked the door to the penthouse and stepped inside. The city lights shimmered through the large windows that overlooked the skyline. The living room was calm and carefully arranged, just as it always was. His fiancée sat on the couch reading something on her tablet. She looked up when he entered. "You're home earlier than I expected," she said casually. Jeffrey placed his keys on the table. "I needed to talk." She studied his expression for a moment. There was something different about him tonight. More serious, more focused. She set the tablet aside. "What's going on?" she asked. Jeffrey didn't sit down. Instead, he remained standing across the room. "I got the DNA results today." For the first time that evening, her calm expression shifted slightly, but she recovered quickly. "And?" she asked. Jeffrey met her eyes directly. "Sheldon is my son." The words hung quietly in the air. She didn't react with shock. Not really. Which confirmed something Jeffrey had already suspected. She leaned back slowly against the couch. "I see," she said. Jeffrey crossed his arms. "You already knew that was possible." She hesitated before answering, "Yes." The honesty in her response was almost unsettling. Jeffrey felt the tension inside him rise. "Zendaya sent me emails 3 years ago," he continued. "I saw them." His fiancée remained quiet. Jeffrey stepped a little closer. "She tried to tell me she was pregnant." Still no response. Jeffrey's voice lowered slightly. "But I never received those messages." Now, her gaze shifted. "Just briefly," Jeffrey noticed. "Did you intercept them?" he asked. Silence filled the room for several seconds. Finally, she stood from the couch and walked slowly toward the window. The city stretched out below them. "I didn't intercept them directly," she said carefully. Jeffrey waited. "But I did speak with Zendaya," she added. Jeffrey's jaw tightened. "What did you say to her?" She turned slightly, folding her arms. "I told her the truth." Jeffrey frowned. "What truth?" "That your career was about to change," she said. "That you were stepping into a leadership role that required stability and a clean public image." Jeffrey shook his head slowly. "You had no right to make that decision for me." She exhaled. "I was protecting your future." Jeffrey's voice sharpened. "By keeping me from knowing I had a child." Her tone grew firmer. "You were about to become CEO of a major company. A scandal involving a former student and a pregnancy could have destroyed everything you worked for." Jeffrey stared at her. "That wasn't your choice to make." She met his gaze without hesitation. "If I hadn't stepped in, your entire career might have collapsed before it even started." Jeffrey felt anger rising now. Not loud anger, the kind that settles deep. "You manipulated the situation," he said. "I made a practical decision," she replied. Jeffrey laughed quietly. "There's nothing practical about stealing 3 years of someone's life." The words hit harder than he expected. His fiancée's expression hardened slightly. "You're being dramatic." Jeffrey shook his head again. "No." He looked at her carefully. "For the first time I'm seeing this clearly." She crossed her arms. "And what exactly do you think you're seeing?" Jeffrey answered without hesitation. A relationship built on control. The room grew still. His fiancée stared at him for several seconds. Then she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. So what happens now? Jeffrey didn't need time to think. The engagement is over. Her eyes widened slightly. You're serious? Yes. She stepped forward. You're throwing away everything we've built. Jeffrey remained calm. No. He gestured toward the window where the city lights stretched endlessly. That life was built on a lie. Silence settled across the room. For the first time since the conversation began, his fiancée looked uncertain. Jeffrey picked up his keys again. I won't build the rest of my life that way. He walked toward the door. Behind him, she spoke once more. You think Zendaya will just welcome you back? Jeffrey paused. Then he answered honestly. I don't know. And that was the truth. Zendaya didn't owe him forgiveness. She didn't owe him another chance. But one thing had become clear. Jeffrey had spent years building a reputation as a decisive leader. Now he was finally making the most important decision of his personal life. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway. And for the first time since learning the truth about Sheldon, Jeffrey felt something new beginning. Not certainty, but the chance to start doing what he should have done years ago. Taking responsibility. The night Jeffrey walked out of the penthouse felt strangely quiet. The city below continued moving as usual. Traffic lights changed. Cars moved through intersections. People laughed outside restaurants and bars. Life continued. But for Jeffrey, something inside had shifted permanently. For the first time in years, the path in front of him wasn't defined by boardrooms, investors, or corporate strategy. It was defined by something much simpler. Responsibility. He drove through the quiet streets without rushing, his thoughts moving carefully through everything that had happened in the last few days. The DNA result. Sheldon's smile. The conversation with his fiancée. 3 years of lost time. Jeffrey didn't pretend those years could be erased, but he knew something important. What mattered now was what he did next. The following afternoon, Jeffrey returned to the community center, the same building that now felt more meaningful to him than most of the skyscrapers he spent his time inside. Children's voices echoed through the hallway as he stepped through the door. The place was busy, just like before. Students sat at tables working through homework assignments. Volunteers helped younger children with reading exercises while others played games in the activity room. Zendaya stood near a table, helping 2 teenagers review a math worksheet. When she noticed Jeffrey entering, she paused for a moment. The expression on his face looked different, calmer, but also more serious. Zendaya finished explaining the problem to the students before walking over. Hello, Jeffrey, she said. Hi. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because both of them understood that this conversation carried weight. Zendaya folded her arms lightly. You look like someone who had a difficult night, she said. Jeffrey nodded slightly. I ended the engagement. Zendaya didn't look surprised. She simply studied his expression for a few seconds. That must have been complicated. It was necessary, Jeffrey replied. Zendaya believed him, because the man standing in front of her looked very different from the one she remembered years ago. Back then, Jeffrey had been ambitious but cautious. Now there was something more grounded about him. What happens now? She asked. Jeffrey glanced toward the far side of the room. Sheldon sat on the floor with several other children, building something elaborate with colorful blocks. The boy's voice rose proudly as he explained his creation. Jeffrey felt a small smile appear on his face. What happens now, he said quietly, is that I learn how to be part of his life. Zendaya watched him carefully. That's not something that happens overnight. I know, Jeffrey said. I missed 3 years. Zendaya didn't soften the truth. Yes, you did. Jeffrey accepted the words without argument. I can't change that, he said. But I can change what happens next. Zendaya looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. You're serious about this? Yes. His answer came without hesitation. Zendaya leaned back slightly against the table. I believe you, she said. Jeffrey seemed surprised by the response. You do? Zendaya nodded. Because the Jeffrey I knew years ago would have done exactly what you're doing now. If he had known, Jeffrey felt a quiet weight lift from his chest. Thank you, he said softly. But Zendaya wasn't finished. That doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was, she added. Jeffrey understood. It shouldn't. Zendaya's voice remained calm. Trust doesn't rebuild instantly. Jeffrey nodded. I'm not expecting it to. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Zendaya spoke again. We focus on Sheldon first. Jeffrey didn't hesitate. Agreed. Zendaya glanced across the room. Sheldon had now finished building his tower and was proudly showing it to another child. He's curious about everything, Zendaya said. Jeffrey chuckled. I noticed. Zendaya smiled faintly. He asks 100 questions a day. Jeffrey watched Sheldon carefully. I'll answer as many as I can. At that moment, Sheldon noticed Jeffrey standing near the table. His face brightened immediately. Hey! He ran across the room, leaving his block tower behind. Sheldon stopped directly in front of him. You came back again. Jeffrey crouched slightly. I told you I would. Sheldon nodded approvingly. Then he looked between Jeffrey and Zendaya. So, does this mean it's official now? Jeffrey smiled. What do you mean? Sheldon thought carefully. You're my dad, right? Zendaya watched the moment quietly. Jeffrey answered gently. Yes. Sheldon's face lit up. Cool. The boy seemed satisfied with that answer. Then he grabbed Jeffrey's hand without hesitation. Dad, come see my tower. The word came naturally. No hesitation. No awkwardness. Zendaya blinked slightly in surprise. Children often adjust to life changes faster than adults expect. Jeffrey glanced at Zendaya briefly. She didn't look upset. She looked thoughtful, because the moment carried meaning for all three of them. Jeffrey followed Sheldon across the room toward the colorful block tower. Careful, Sheldon said proudly. It's very important. Jeffrey laughed. I can see that. Zendaya watched them from across the room. For the first time in years, something inside her began to feel lighter. The past had caused pain, but the future now carried something different. Not certainty, not perfection, just the possibility of building something new. And sometimes that possibility is enough to begin again. The first weeks after Jeffrey learned the truth about Sheldon felt unlike any period of his life before. For years, Jeffrey's schedule had been structured around efficiency. Meetings began on time. Flights departed precisely. Decisions were calculated carefully. Everything in his world followed systems. Fatherhood did not follow systems. It followed curiosity, and curiosity belonged entirely to Sheldon. One Saturday morning, Jeffrey arrived at the community center earlier than usual. The weekend programs had just started. A few volunteers arranged art supplies while children gathered near a table covered with paper and crayons. Zendaya stood near the doorway speaking with one of the volunteers when she noticed Jeffrey walking in. She smiled. You're early. Jeffrey shrugged lightly. Sheldon said the art table opens at 9. Zendaya laughed softly. He takes schedules very seriously. Jeffrey nodded. I'm learning that. Before Zendaya could say anything else, Sheldon spotted him. Dad. The boy ran across the room with a kind of excitement that only children seem to carry naturally. Jeffrey crouched down just in time to catch the small hug that followed. You're on time, Sheldon announced proudly. I didn't want to miss the art table. Jeffrey grinned. Good thinking. Sheldon grabbed his hand immediately. Come on. The boy pulled him toward the long table where crayons and paper waited. Zendaya watched quietly from a short distance. Weeks earlier, she had wondered how Jeffrey would adjust to fatherhood. Now she was beginning to see the answer. Slowly, naturally. Jeffrey sat beside Sheldon while the boy began drawing something that looked like a dinosaur riding a rocket. What is that? Jeffrey asked. Sheldon answered confidently. It's a space dinosaur. Jeffrey nodded seriously. That makes sense. Sheldon paused. Do you know how to draw rockets? Jeffrey considered the question. I know how to run companies, he said. Sheldon looked unimpressed. That's not the same thing. Zendaya laughed from across the room. Jeffrey raised his hands in surrender. You might be right. Sheldon handed him a crayon. Try anyway. Jeffrey leaned over the paper and began drawing something that resembled a very crooked rocket. Sheldon studied it carefully. Then he nodded. That's not bad. Jeffrey smiled. High praise. Moments like that surprised him. Not because they were dramatic, but because they felt meaningful in a quiet way. Jeffrey had spent years celebrating major corporate victories, but none of those victories compared to the satisfaction of hearing Sheldon say, "That's not bad." Later that afternoon, the community center organized a small basketball game for the children. Sheldon insisted Jeffrey join the activity. Dads have to play too, he explained. Jeffrey stood awkwardly at first, unsure how seriously to take the game. But Sheldon ran onto the court with endless enthusiasm. Pass it. Jeffrey tossed the ball gently. Sheldon missed the first shot, then the second, then the third. Finally, the fourth attempt bounced into the hoop. Sheldon jumped with excitement. I did it. Jeffrey raised both hands. That was impressive. Zendaya watched from the bench. There was something honest about the way Jeffrey interacted with the children. He didn't try to act like someone he wasn't. He simply showed up. That mattered more than anything. Later that evening, after most of the children had gone home, Zendaya and Jeffrey sat near the entrance while Sheldon finished packing his backpack. You're adjusting faster than I expected, Zendaya said. Jeffrey leaned back in the chair. Sheldon is a good teacher. Zendaya smiled. What has he taught you so far? Jeffrey thought about it. That success means something different than I thought. Zendaya raised an eyebrow. How so? Jeffrey glanced across the room at Sheldon. For years I believed success meant building something impressive. Zendaya nodded slowly. And now? Jeffrey smiled faintly. Now I think success means being present for the people who matter. Zendaya didn't respond immediately, because the man speaking now sounded wiser than the one she had known years ago. Across the room, Sheldon ran back toward them. Ready? He grabbed Jeffrey's hand again. Dad, can we come back tomorrow? Jeffrey looked at Zendaya briefly. She nodded. Yes, Jeffrey said. We can come back tomorrow. Sheldon smiled. For Jeffrey, the answer felt simple, because for the first time in years his priorities were finally clear. And that clarity had nothing to do with business. It had everything to do with family. Life began settling into a new rhythm for Jeffrey. His days still included board meetings, investor calls, and company strategy discussions, but those things no longer defined the entire structure of his life. Now his calendar had different priorities. Community center visits, weekend park trips, conversations about dinosaurs and rocket ships, and the small but important moments that came with being present for Sheldon. Jeffrey discovered something interesting about children. They don't care about job titles. Sheldon never once asked about market growth or company profits. Instead, his question sounded very different. Dad, why do clouds move? Dad, how many pancakes can someone eat? Dad, do astronauts get scared? Jeffrey answered every question seriously, even when the answers required creativity. Zendaya often watched those conversations with quiet amusement, because the powerful CEO she once knew had become someone Sheldon viewed simply as his father. And Jeffrey seemed to welcome that role. But not everyone was comfortable with the changes happening in Jeffrey's life. One morning during a board meeting, Jeffrey noticed something unusual. The conversation had moved away from company finances and toward something more personal. One of the senior investors leaned forward. We've heard about your situation, the man said carefully. Jeffrey knew exactly what he meant. News travels quickly in corporate circles. My personal life hasn't changed my commitment to the company, Jeffrey replied calmly. Another investor spoke next. That's not our concern. Jeffrey waited. The man continued. In fact, the way you handled the situation has increased respect for your leadership. Jeffrey raised an eyebrow slightly. The investor explained. Most executives try to hide complicated personal matters. Jeffrey listened quietly. But you acknowledged the truth and took responsibility, the man said. That kind of integrity builds trust. Several other board members nodded. Jeffrey realized something important in that moment. The fear that had once shaped his earlier decisions had been based on assumptions. The truth had not damaged his reputation. It had strengthened it. Later that afternoon, Zendaya received an unexpected message. The number looked familiar. She stared at the screen for a moment before opening it. It was Jeffrey's former fiancée. The message was short. We need to talk. Zendaya sat quietly in the small office at the community center. She had expected something like this eventually. Some people don't walk away easily when control slips from their hands. Zendaya typed a brief reply. What is it? The response came quickly. Jeffrey is making a mistake. Zendaya read the message without reacting. Another one followed. His world is different from yours. Zendaya leaned back slightly in the chair. 3 years earlier, those words might have affected her. Back then, she had believed stepping aside was necessary for Jeffrey's success. But time had changed her perspective. Zendaya typed her answer calmly. Jeffrey makes his own choices. Several seconds passed before the next message appeared. You think love is enough for his world? Zendaya read the words carefully. Then she typed her final reply. Honesty is enough. After that, she blocked the number. The conversation ended there. A few days later, Jeffrey approached Zendaya with an idea. They were standing outside the community center while Sheldon played nearby with a small group of children. My company is hosting a charity gala next week, Jeffrey said. Zendaya looked curious. That sounds formal. It usually is, Jeffrey admitted. Zendaya waited for him to continue. I'd like you and Sheldon to come with me. Zendaya studied his face carefully. Are you sure that's a good idea? Jeffrey nodded. Yes. Zendaya crossed her arms lightly. Why? Jeffrey smiled faintly. Because I'm not hiding my family. The word family lingered in the air for a moment. Zendaya felt something warm settle in her chest. All right, she said. The evening of the gala arrived quickly. The hotel ballroom was filled with elegant lighting and soft music. Executives, investors, and community leaders gathered around small tables while waiters moved quietly between conversations. When Jeffrey entered the room, attention shifted immediately. But this time, he wasn't alone. Zendaya walked beside him, calm and confident, and Sheldon held Jeffrey's hand proudly. The boy wore a small suit that made him look especially serious. Sheldon studied the room with great interest. Wow, he whispered. Jeffrey chuckled. Big rooms can be impressive. Several executives approached them. Jeffrey introduced Zendaya naturally, and Sheldon shook hands with the seriousness of someone completing an important task. Zendaya noticed something surprising. Nobody questioned their presence. Nobody whispered. Instead, most people smiled warmly at Sheldon. Later that evening, Sheldon tugged on Jeffrey's sleeve. Dad. Yes? Sheldon looked around the ballroom. Your work friends are nice. Jeffrey laughed. I'm glad you think so. Zendaya watched the scene quietly, because something important had just happened. The world Jeffrey once believed required hiding the truth had accepted it easily, and in that moment, the past finally lost its power over them. Time has a quiet way of showing whether people truly mean the promises they make. In the months that followed the gala, Jeffrey didn't try to impress Zendaya with grand gestures or dramatic speeches. He did something far more important. He stayed. Every week, Jeffrey returned to the community center. Sometimes he helped children with homework. Other times he sat beside Sheldon while the boy built impossible inventions out of blocks and toy parts. Zendaya noticed something during those months. Jeffrey wasn't performing fatherhood. He was learning it, patiently. One afternoon, Sheldon spread a large sheet of paper across a table and began drawing. Jeffrey sat beside him. What are you working on? He asked. Sheldon spoke while concentrating on the picture. Our house. Jeffrey looked closer. 3 stick figures stood in front of a square building. 1 tall, 1 medium, 1 small. Jeffrey pointed gently. That one is you. Sheldon nodded. And that one is Mommy. Jeffrey pointed to the tallest figure. And that must be me. Sheldon smiled. Yeah. Jeffrey looked at the drawing for a moment longer. Then Sheldon added something unexpected. I like it when we're all together. Zendaya, who had been organizing books nearby, paused when she heard that. Not because the words were surprising, but because they were simple and honest in the way children often speak. Jeffrey glanced toward her. Their eyes met briefly. Neither said anything. But the message was clear. Family had slowly begun forming around them again. Spring arrived several weeks later. Warm sunlight replaced the colder air, and the city parks filled with people enjoying the longer days. One Saturday afternoon, Jeffrey, Zendaya, and Sheldon sat together on a park bench while Sheldon finished a small ice cream cone. The boy looked thoughtful, which usually meant a question was coming. Mommy. Zendaya looked down at him. Yes? Sheldon pointed his spoon toward Jeffrey. Are you and Dad going to get married? Zendaya nearly choked on her lemonade. Jeffrey blinked in surprise. Children never worry about timing when curiosity appears. Zendaya cleared her throat gently. That's a very big question. Sheldon shrugged. Families do that sometimes. Jeffrey laughed softly. He's not wrong. Zendaya gave him a look that said she wasn't going to answer that question casually in front of a 6-year-old with ice cream on his face. Sheldon finished the last bite and ran toward a nearby climbing structure. Jeffrey and Zendaya watched him for a moment. Then Jeffrey spoke quietly. I've thought about that question too. Zendaya turned toward him. You have? Jeffrey nodded. I don't want to repeat the past. Zendaya understood what he meant. Years earlier, they had loved each other deeply, but allowed outside pressure to decide their future. Jeffrey continued. This time, I want to build something honestly. Zendaya studied his face carefully. What does that look like to you? Jeffrey thought for a moment. It looks like patience. Zendaya raised an eyebrow. That's a new word in your vocabulary. Jeffrey smiled. I've had good teachers. He glanced toward the playground where Sheldon was climbing a ladder with intense concentration. Zendaya followed his gaze. Jeffrey reached gently for her hand. I'm not asking you to forget everything that happened, he said. Zendaya listened quietly. But I am asking if we can build something better than what we had before. Zendaya felt the warmth of his hand in hers. The past had caused real pain. Lost years. Hard choices. But she also saw something else now. Growth. Jeffrey had changed. Not because life became easier, but because he chose responsibility when it mattered most. Zendaya smiled softly. I think we can try. Jeffrey nodded. Trying is enough. A year later, a small ceremony took place in a quiet garden near the community center. Nothing extravagant. No massive guest list. Just a small group of people who cared about them. Soft music played from a speaker, while simple decorations hung between the trees. Sheldon stood proudly between Jeffrey and Zendaya, wearing a small suit that looked slightly too serious for a child his age. The boy held both their hands as they walked together toward the front. Jeffrey looked down at him. You ready for this job? He asked. Sheldon nodded confidently. I've been ready. Zendaya laughed quietly. Because if anyone had helped bring them back together, it had been Sheldon. When the ceremony began, the words spoken were simple. Promises about honesty, commitment, and choosing each other again with clearer understanding. When Jeffrey and Zendaya exchanged their vows, neither spoke about perfect love. They spoke about something stronger, learning, growing, and standing beside each other even when life becomes complicated. At the end of the ceremony, Sheldon clapped first. Finally, he said proudly. Everyone laughed. Years later, Sheldon would ask about the story of how his parents found their way back to each other. Jeffrey and Zendaya never told the story as something tragic. They told it as a story about truth. Because the most important lesson wasn't about wealth or success. It was about courage. The courage to face the past. The courage to accept responsibility. And the courage to rebuild something meaningful when life offers another chance. Love doesn't become stronger because life is easy. Love becomes stronger when people choose honesty. And keep choosing it. Day after day. Year after year. Heart by heart. If this story touched your heart, take a moment and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Sometimes people walk away from love because life gets complicated, but this story reminds us that truth, responsibility, and courage can bring people back together in ways we never expected. And before you go, tell me something in the comments. Do you believe people deserve a second chance at love after life separates them? Your stories and thoughts are always welcome here. And if you haven't already, subscribe and join the Mr. Graham Stories family so you never miss the next powerful story.